Hi everyone. In this video, we're gonna write some tests for our backend. It's gonna be an interesting one, so let's get right into it. Very first thing that I'm going to do, as usual, add a new module. It's going to be a dev dependency. We're gonna use jest to test our code, and we also need ts_jest to make sure that we can use jest in TypeScript and also the types for jest as well. That should work, and we will create a configuration file for jest, and that should be inside a root folder. So way over here, there we go. I believe jest.config.js is what it is. Yeah, there we go. Do that. We're basically saying, okay, we're gonna test, run our tests in Node, and we're also going to use test, so TypeScript as well. We do that. And yep, we also need to basically add a script in our package.json so that we can run it. Let's just paste it there. And just to see if everything works, all right, I'm going to create a file called just, an example.test.ts. Go back right here, just grab a hold of that, paste it, and from here, run yarn test. So let's see if it does work. Okay, fantastic. So basically all I'm doing here is configuring my jest testing environments, and I'm creating a new file called example.test.ts. So jest what it'll basically do is look inside your project folder and files, find any file that has test as its name inside its name, and run it. So this particular test, it just says it should pass because we're expecting true to be truthy. So of course it's gonna pass. All right, having that said, I believe we can remove it. Right, okay, let's just remove that, delete that, we don't need that anymore. And for our tests, the type of tests that we want to write are those that are for our resolvers. So we want to test whether so a few things here, whether or not we're actually able to handle operations related to the database or Postgres database, and eventually we're also going to handle mocking GraphQL requests coming in. Right? So there's a lot of things that we actually have to set up before even running tests, like connecting to the database, for example. Right? So what we're going to do now, we're going to basically set up our tests, and after all of our tests has run, we're going to tear it down. I encourage you to read through this if it's your first time using jest or testing in general. Now, what we aren't going to do is create another test file called getUsers.test.ts. And we're going to grab that, go over to our code, resolvers, users, and create another file, getUsers.test.ts. Paste that over. It should look okay except for this, because I believe we named that create typeform connection. But I'm pretty sure we did. Okay, so I think it should work. Now let's see if it does. Oh, before we do that, I'll go through the code a little bit here. Before running any of our tests, we are creating a connection to our database just to make sure that our typeform operations will work. And after running all of our databases, we're going to close that connection. And our test itself is saying that we are going to get array of users, and we're not actually going to do anything with GraphQL yet. We're just going to try to test out some typeform stuff. So we're saying user.find, save that into a variable called users, and very simple, we're just going to expect the users to be defined. Right? If user.find doesn't work, and if there was an error, like of course this test will not pass. So let's try it out. Let's test it out. Okay, so let's see here. All right, it did well. Now, the problem with this, there are a few things that we do need to change here, is that if we go back, say test create typeform connection. We're connecting to our Postgres database using typeform, and we are configuring that inside our ORM config here, right? And remember the fact that we actually had 3 separate configurations for 3 different environments: our development, test, and post-production. When you run yarn test, it will be automatically, the process.env.node environment should automatically be set to test. We can actually check if that is correct. So process.env.node env, right? We can see if what I am saying is true. Let's see here, right? Console.log and 18th it says test, right? So it will be correctly grabbing the configuration from here, right? The problem here is that, well, the actual database that we're using for testing is set to Meetingstone, which is our development database, and we don't want that, right? So what I'm going to do here is actually change this, and just to show you that it really is what I say it is. This should give us an error because there we go, we do not have a database with the name Meetingstone -test yet. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go over here, we'll connect to that local. Let's create a database called Meetingstone test, and we're going to go inside. Nothing here yet, right? Refresh it, nothing here. And then we're going to yarn dev. Nope, not yarn dev, yarn test. I believe it's still going to throw an error, but a different kind, or it says it's all good. If we refresh this, all right, there we have our user table. Cool. And the reason why it's doing that is because, or if the reason why it works, so what I wanted to show you is that if this was set to false, right, and we were to delete that table, refresh that, because if you take a look at our development configuration, it is set to false, right? So if we set synchronize to false and we run yarn test, it should probably give us an error. There we go, because no such table exists, right? However, if we set synchronize to true, again, what that means is that when typeform makes the connection to the database, it'll actually compare how the tables look like to our own code, and then basically bridge the gap, right? So if we set synchronize to true, save that again, run the test, and as we run the test, typeform is going to make a connection to our test database, at which point it will basically update our database to actually have users there. And you'll notice that I'm also setting drop schema to true, while here it doesn't even have it. Drop schema, what that would do is whenever we, I believe when we're creating the connection to our database, it will drop all the schemas beforehand and then synchronize afterwards, thereby making sure that there are no data. So when you run tests over and over again later on, currently our test only includes basically finding users, but we will need to add creating users in the database. If we run tests over and over again, there will be actual rows inside our tables that persist, right? But we don't want that, at least for our test databases. So we're going to set our drop schema to true so that every time typeform connects to your test database, it'll basically drop everything and then build all the schema from scratch so that it's like a fresh state. Cool. So that's all good. Let's go back to our notes to see. Yep, we talked about that. Alrighty here. So we're going to add this in our test, right? Because right now, all we're doing is saying that users to be defined, and that's all we are saying. But if we say users.length to be greater than 0, basically saying that, hey, listen, let's test if we actually get some data back instead of an empty array. You can imagine that this test is going to fail because we are not using our dev database, we are using our test database, and at least right now, there are no rows inside here. So we run yarn test again, it should fail. There we go. And let's take a look at why it's saying that, okay, get array of users expected is 0 and or greater than 0, but what we have received is 0, so that's why it failed. So what we are going to do is, before running these tests, we're going to make it so that, well, because what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is, for the user, for the API consumer, test if when they send a request, send a GraphQL request to retrieve users, so a collection of users, an array of users, most likely that would include users, like an actual user objects instead of an array, instead of a empty one. So we're going to try to mimic that, or like actually make it so that inside our database there will be rows for our users, and then actually be able to send that back. So what we're going to do here is actually create one before testing it. So we're going to do that. We're going to create a user and then save it, and then basically say, okay, try to get a hold of users and then see if users.length is greater than 0. All right, so let's save that. Yarn test. All right, everything passed. So it is going as expected. We can also just console log users just to see if that actually did work exactly the way that we expect it to work. Yep, there we go. It's an array of a single user inside. Cool. And from there, what we can do is actually not just say, okay, listen, so we want to make sure that the array that we receive from finding users actually includes at least one user inside. We can also try to match how the object inside that array looks like. So what we're going to do here is, instead of all of that, do this. So we're creating a new user that looks like that. Now, one thing to note here is that the variable new user is actually not a user instance because it's just an object literal, right? With first name as hello, last name as world, and email at email.com. Now we're using that object literal as our parameters for our user.create method, right? And then we're saving it, and then at that point we will actually save a user instance, and then afterwards we're trying to retrieve users from a database. Now the users that we get back should match the object literal that we use to actually create the user, right? So that's kind of the intention behind those lines of code right there. Okay, so let's see if this works. Fantastic, so it actually does work. All right. The next thing here is that we now see that we can save a new user to our database in our test database, and from our test database retrieve it, and we've basically tested that out. However, when we're trying to actually write tests for our resolvers, it doesn't end there. That's only half the story, right? We're basically using typeform to make some operations onto our database, but we're not actually doing anything with GraphQL, right? So we want to mimic that as well. So what we're going to do here is create another file called sendTestGraphQL.ts. All right, in our utils, we're going to say .ts. And we are going to grab a hold of this code right here and save it. I'll kind of go through what this means. We're basically, the GraphQL library also has a method to send a GraphQL request, and that's what we're using right here. Right, we are sending a GraphQL request with a particular schema, and the source is going to be, you'll see, source is where we actually basically indicate which query or mutation that we're using and all of that. So we're basically creating a utility function to actually send GraphQL requests in our tests. And one thing just to note here is interface. If this is new to you, there is a pretty handy block that basically kind of goes over what that does. But essentially, that's just we're using the interface options to make sure that, so if I don't do that, it's going to complain that, okay, listen, you need to basically define the type for this, and that's what we're doing right here. Cool, so we do that. Using this, what we can do then is, in our tests, we can grab, let's do this, let's grab a hold of the whole thing inside here, just paste it below here, I guess, and here. Again, command period should open that up. Now again, it's not perfect all the time. Usually if it auto imports using SRC, it's very likely that that will not work. So let's just edit that a tiny bit. Okay, that's cool. So you'll notice that basically we are writing out our GraphQL query, get user's email, first name, last name, and then we're using our utility function that we created called send test GraphQL, and the source is basically this query, get users, or let's start calling this query. Right? And that will basically send back, that will return a promise in which we await upon it. It will be the response. Cool. Now, from here, basically what we're saying is, from that response, get data and get users, or let me do this for you, to match object new user, right? A few things over here, you might say, hey, what is that exclamation mark here? If we don't do that, it's going to complain that, hey, listen, object is possibly undefined, saying that the response, yeah, that's true. The response can be, it can send back an undefined response. Response.data could be undefined because, well, what if we don't find any users, or what if this whole thing doesn't work? We will still get some sort of response, but it could be like an error response, so on and so forth, right? So basically Typeworm is saying, hey, listen, response.data may not exist. It may be undefined. But what we're saying is, no, don't worry about it. It will be defined, so chill. We're gonna save this. For some reason, that's not working, but that's fine. We're gonna save this here and run our test. It should work. There we go. Fantastic. So, all right. We could also just not do that at all, because we're basically where all we're doing is actually testing if user.find works. I mean, it should work, right? User.find, the method find, is coming from Typeworm, which is heavily tested by the contributors of that library. What we really want to test is our own code, which is basically our resolver, get user resolver. So there we go. We're not testing that. We're testing the response.data.getUsers, and the first one to look like the one that we've just saved here. Cool. Let's try that again. It should work. Fantastic. Fantastic. So this test is up and running. Makes me feel good. The last thing that I'm going to change here is that, well, these are all hard-coded, right? Hello and world. Now, if this is the only test that will ever exist in this project, I guess that's fine, but it will likely not be. We will have a lot more tests that we will write, and in that case, we just have to make sure that, oh, well, if one test is actually creating a user with the email@email.com, and another test does so again, then the test will break because of the unique constraint for the field email, right? So we just have to make sure when we're hard coding the actual information, we want to make sure that it's email, and another test is email 2, and another test is email 3, so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, that's quite tedious and it just doesn't work. So instead, what we're going to do is dynamically just generate these kind of dummy data. And there is a really nice library that we can use to do so. It's called Faker. So we're going to grab a hold of that, actually add Faker as our dev dependency. Cool. And we're going to import Faker in our test, like so. And right here, replace this part with that code right there. So what this is doing is we're basically seeding the library with the current millisecond, because Faker generates these random or data. However, even for that to happen, it basically gets its randomness from a number, an integer. So if you don't actually seed it, you may end up, so if two tests run at the same time and both test is using something like faker.name.firstname, you could end up with the same exact value, because that's how Faker basically kind of mimics randomness. So what we're doing is saying, okay, let's use the current millisecond and use that as our seed, just to ensure that the data the information, the values that we create with Faker will be unique and different between tests. So that's what we're doing. We're doing faker.seed here, and then we're creating a new user, but instead of it being hard-coded with hello world or at email.com, we're actually just using faker.name.firstname, faker.name.lastname, faker.internet.email, so on and so forth. And if you want to see what that actually looks like, we could take a look. You can see Faker in action. Do that. Let's test our code again. Very cool. So this is the data, or the values that Faker created. Very interesting. And all of our tests are passing. Very cool. So there you go. You wrote your first test for your resolver, and moving forward, we will try our best to stick with TDD and write tests for all of our code moving forward. All right, that's it for this video. See you guys later.